I want everyone to keep a specific line from this record in mind as we talk through all of this. It comes off of the fourth track on the latest Voidz record, Like All Before You, where Julian sings, "Sorry I was not the man you wanted me to be, but if I could beg you, maybe stop punishing me." I've seen a lot of negative energy directed at this latest LP from the Voidz, certainly not like their other records, which may be quote unquote more conceptual. Certainly Tyranny has a sonic voice that stays consistent through that whole record. And then even Virtue, though it hops from genre to genre in a lot of songs, is still held together by this overarching theme, which itself is the title of the album. I think I'm just kind of caught off guard and even confused by Voidz fans specifically seeing this record, Like All Before You, and having such qualms about elements that, in all honesty, are things they should have expected as being Voidz fans. With an album like Tyranny, for example, that there was a massive deviation, especially for a guy like Julian Casablancas, where this record was, in essence, his second solo album, except it was with a different backing band than he had for Phrases of the Young. The overlap, though, there, because Jeff Kite, Jake Bercovici, and Alex Karapetis worked both on the tour of Phrases for the Young and then joined in this band that was Julian Casablancas and the Voidz, which then, heading up to their second LP, Virtue, became simply the Voidz, as it became more of an artistic collective than a Julian Casablancas song machine. And even the hop from the sounds of Tyranny to Virtue is stark. It further affirms one of the strongest artistic statements by the band, which is that you cannot pin their sound down into a particular frame. They do have certain, sonic motifs and such that are especially to the heart of a guy like Julian Casablancas in terms of like his favorite progressions and such, and even certain mixing preferences. But the songs between Tyranny and Virtue don't really have a whole lot in common. There are certain things that carry over from one record to the next, but it also established the intention of the band to want to keep trying to push themselves into different boundaries and to try and bring in sounds that might not feel native to the type of stuff that they were making before. All of this comes in the pursuit of trying to push themselves as musicians, as artists, and through both of those, also trying to just push the medium that they so love forward, whatever and wherever forward might be. And so I'm simply dumbfounded then when I see quote-unquote Voidz fans hear this latest record, Like All Before You, and then have such issues, calling it lazy, Julian not even trying, the band's weakest release to date. And while I'm not necessarily trying to make a case that it might be better than Tyranny, better than Virtue, I think in some cases, in some moods, it is better than Virtue. But when you have this catalog of theirs that so illustrates this point, even up to the swath of singles that they've released post-Virtue, I don't get how this could be an issue to have with the band. And if anything, to me, it just illustrates one of my biggest gripes with, in one way, music, in another way, art, which is art as expectation versus art as what it is. It's like Rolling Stone gave this record 2.5 stars, saying that basically it is just a game of roulette where you may land on some sounds and moods you like, but they never stay around for you to enjoy that. I don't even remember like the full argument being made, but it had a detached feel just given the work that the Voidz have released prior. There's nothing inside of this latest record, Like All Before You, that is inconsistent with what the band has been doing all along. And at least to me, as someone who has avidly listened to this music, has followed along on their progression, has even tried to better understand how it is they do the things they do because they are artists that I appreciate, I find it also especially discouraging that the people who helped bring up a group like this and help support a group like this are so easily ready to start tearing it down when it starts going in a direction that they aren't anticipating. To quote the very first song off of Tyranny, Take Me in Your Army, it took them 1,000 years to build and only a day after to destroy it. Within the wall of reaction, one of the main gripes I've heard with Like All Before You is Julian's use of autotune. And many people keep saying there's too much autotune. One thing that frustrates me about this specifically is it can be a valid critique, but from how it is raised in the context of this album, it's raised as a purely material thing in the sense that we've seen other artists use autotune, and they use it in ways to maybe mask their inability to hit certain notes or trying to clean up their vocals in some capacity. But looking back to other songs in the Voidz discography, autotune has never had that function. It's always been a stylistic choice that Julian has played with even back to The Strokes. In my album ranking video, which was one of the first videos on this channel, I talked about how Angles marked a specific departure for Julian Casablancas and how he approached his voice. If you listen to Angles, it's the first album inside of the Strokes discography where Julian really plays with layering his voice and trying to harmonize his voice in ways beyond just being a singer. He was trying to place his voice in a way that it could help broaden the sounds that are coming from the other areas in the band. And in another way to say that, he was trying to use his voice more as an instrument than as just performing the function of a singer in a rock band. That carried over on Phrases for the Young, which is an incredibly natal version of this Voidz sound that has later come to be with a record like All Before You. But Phrases for the Young was Julian also trying to stretch his voice in that way, trying to mix it to be more of an instrument and have more of a strong sound in that way than simply just trying to just have a quote-unquote good singing voice, which itself is also such an incredibly wide spectrum, because no one can say Bob Dylan is a good singer if they say Adele is a good singer. If they are both good singers, then we have to raise up the element of the actual timbre of the voice inside of how we analyze that, because Bob Dylan has never had a round singing voice. He's always kind of had a raspy voice, but it has a function to his music that enhances the experience. And inside of an album like All Before You, the autotune is performing that same task.
Future Ray here, editing the video now, jumping in to chime on one thing I don't mention inside of this whole video, which is that the album doesn't even have that much auto-tune. Some of the songs do use auto-tune, but I think what many people are complaining about on some of the other songs on the album are just the filters and pedals that Julian puts his voice through, which can add like a metallic sound to it or just change the quality of his voice in other ways, and then just how it's mixed with all of the instruments sometimes makes it kind of tough to hear what he's saying, on top of also the number of vocal tracks that he is combining on those songs. But I just wanted to mention too, it's not sword with autotune either. There are other mixing tricks and filters and stuff that are being applied to his voice that, at least for me, I think contribute to the musical experience.
The album itself, while a compilation versus being something like Virtue and Tyranny, where they are, I guess, more blended together, versus the hodgepodge that this album turned out to be with singles on it that date back to 2023. Like All Before You remains a packaged thing because the Voidz would never release something that was messy and without intention, especially if you know someone like Julian Casablancas, which I don't personally, though, Julian, if you ever want to just get a coffee or play Nintendo GameCube, then you'd understand that there are things that are trying to be said, that they're trying to be articulated, and you can trust that with a band like the Voidz, they are not going to do it in a straightforward way. And that's what we like about them. At least I think that is. That's what I like about them. They've released enough stuff where, in my mind, they've earned the right where if you don't like something of theirs the first time around, you give it a second try. You give it a third try. It's honestly something that I think most artists should deserve to a certain extent, just in terms of like the whole creative pursuit and the soulful, and trying to have a soulful connection with it. But Like All Before You is held together by a simple theme. That theme is that from generation to generation, the same things occur. And through those generations and the repetition of these things, there are certain pieces of knowledge that are gained, certain enlightenment that occurs that may carry over, that may not carry over, but for the purpose of continuing this project being, in essence, humanity, the only hope that we have in getting ourselves to that better point from one generation to the next is to heed these calls. But this album also focuses on how we don't, because as humans, it is a two-sided thing. We are creatures as capable of the most loving good as we are the most heinous of evil. And that has been illustrated from one generation to another generation to another generation, and those past generations with enough distance become so lost to time that it's almost as if they have never even existed. And this album touches on all of that through the 10 songs. In all honesty, through the 9 songs, because the overture and the walk-off are pretty much the same thing, and they don't really do anything else beyond just adding like a cool kind of style to it in the same way a movie has an overture. So in essence, through the 8 songs on this album. Square Wave is the introduction of this desire for enlightenment, and on top of that, an establishment of a theme later expounded on in Prophecy of the Dragon, which is this whole idea that you're setting the table for something, hoping that someone will come and take it, but they inevitably might not. In the case of Square Wave, Julian uses the metaphor of keeping your dinner in the oven, but you never show up, so he just tries again tomorrow. That type of pursuit, you can also argue, is the Sisyphean task of music like the Voidz, because they've been singing about this stuff since 2013. It's been 11 years, and how much has truly changed materially for the better of the world inside of the context of all the protest that the Voidz have expressed. And so Square Wave sets that stage. It establishes this ongoing struggle that the band, and Julian specifically, also has, but more so beyond them. They are simply a microcosm of the greater issue, which is that this is a universal thing for other people. It can be about things like enlightenment, where in Prophecy of the Dragon, it's like of the teacher waiting for the disciples to try and heed his warnings or heed his knowledge, and they might not be able to learn it or absorb it for hundreds or thousands of years. Stuff like that can cause harm from generation to generation, but it's inevitable inside of the scope of humanity. It is one of the main lessons taught through the story of humanity, that certain people, no matter their virtue or no matter their status, they may be able to capture the hearts and minds of people that then helps the world move into a better direction, or sometimes they misuse it and take the world into a worse direction. Seven Horses further illustrates this in a more kind of modern example, where if you look at what the Seven Horses represents inside of like Hindu mythology and whatnot, they're emblematic of ambition and prosperity. And what's interesting with their use inside of this song is that Julian's essentially saying our belief in being able to be taken to prosperity, our ambition to try and have all this wealth and success, in some essences, you can argue that this is capitalism, is what has taken us to hell. That's what's dragged us to hell. You could, of course, can apply this into much more specific things, but it's just kind of a more broad example of how you can interpret this energy and dynamic that's perpetuating the lessons of Like All Before You. Spectral analysis looks at that interesting precipice that people face, where they're looking down some kind of end, whether by intention or by bad actions leading them to a point where they're confronted with everything being over. And on top of that, in all of their pursuits, still trying to find this one thing. The chorus specifically saying, abandoned your family, waiting on the balcony, looking for you. Inside of this song too, there are references to cults and such, where then you can also interpret these lines to be representative of how we try to pursue things and how we end up kind of placing ourselves into our own deathbed. But we do so, we put ourselves into this bad position, all under the guise of trying to find this one hopeful thing. That is a story as old as time. Flexorcist further echoes a lot of this sentiment. More specifically, I want to focus on the bridge where Julian goes, we're not there entirely. We are free, but we're not free. See the list of silenced ones. From the grave they sing us psalms. These are the things that I must do. They are not meant to upset you. Lines maybe you want to think about too inside of this album. Some might just not be ready for the truth. That harkens back to one of the main conflicts inside of Prophecy of the Dragon, but it does so in a much more interesting type of way. While Prophecy of the Dragon has more kind of like that glam rock sound to it, Flexorcist is more about that kind of New Order, Depeche Mode kind of vibe out, you know what I mean? And that's part of the tricks that the Voidz like to play. They're on one hand doing all of this with a sonic mission to continuously try and create new and more interesting sounds, but also do so within a consistent messaging. Perseverance then, which by the way was one of the working titles of this album and is alluded to inside of the line, life proceeds in a sequence, tyranny, virtue, perseverance. This song specifically has kind of a feel that Nintendo Blood did all the way back on Tyranny, especially looking at the chorus where he keeps asking one chance to say, which may also be what the 1C2S stands for inside of the song. Give me one chance to say, do it over again. Give me one chance to say, do it over again. Through history, we look at how our actions that we take trying to carry us forward may actually be causing this harm and almost pushing the world in the opposite direction of our intention. And in hindsight then, when we see that to be the case, we of course wish then to try and change it all, to try and somehow revoke the actions we took. It becomes a plea then. It's a plea to want to try and make things better by stopping ourselves from doing the things that caused harm. The choice of autotune inside of this song specifically, I feel, also adds on to this post-apocalyptic, almost postmodern type of aesthetic that the album is trying to achieve, especially with how it's weaving genres and such together. But specifically, it has just kind of that, it has that feel of a dystopian, like, post-tech city. I can't really express it. Cyberpunk is maybe the word, but that's a video game. And then there's All the Same, which again looks with such a broad lens at the world and boils everything down to a more hopeful type of idea, which is that we're all trying to achieve the same things in spite of going all these different directions and potentially causing all of this harm. We're all trying to pursue the same goal. And that's what makes us all the same. It really doesn't matter anything else. It's just trying to make the world a better place in spite of all of this going down, in spite of whatever surrounding might be going downhill. And When Will the Time of These Bastards End is your typical type of Voidz song against the power. There was a really good word that I read in Naomi Fry's interview with Julian. To use the word that I read in the Naomi Fry interview with Julian Casablancas. When Will the Time of These Bastards End is a quite recalcitrant song. Recalcitrant. How do you spell that? This is going to be on the test. It's your typical Voidz stand up to authority song, but it ties into all of these themes of Like All Before You, where there's always the oppressed and the oppressor. And this song specifically looks to question many aspects of the oppressor, who to try to convey that the things that they're doing are for the best. Righteous life is what righteous life is, so they believe. And yet there are certain places where then they're robbing others of a prosperity that should be applicable to other things. I think of the line, not Ukraine, but Yemen's okay, Libya's okay too, I guess. Which goes ultimately to just question, inside of that context, how Western hegemony can sometimes dictate what might be morally righteous and what is morally abhorrent. I'm not well educated enough inside of the Yemeni civil war to really say whether, or like how correct of a moral claim that is, but I can especially say, just given the conflicts ongoing in the Middle East, there are so many innocent people who are subjected to this horror and were being robbed of any chance to make a life for themselves, all under the guise of being aligned supposedly with a bad power, because simply it's been deemed that by the powers that be. And then the walk-off is the walk-off. It's just the overture again. But every one of these songs comes together. They all fit inside of this same theme of just these lessons that can be gathered from history and from the failures of humanity, and on top of that, how those failures and even the perceived successes have brought us to this point where we again are put to the top part of that cycle of trying to fix the things that are wrong. But in trying to fix them, the problems created themselves are unanswered then. And so when you're taking these good actions, how is it that you possibly could be doing bad things? It's a complicated question, but it's why civilization is such a messy thing and why we try to look to history to course correct in the future. Like All Before You, if anything, is a cautionary phrase. It's trying to look at how the modern times that we live in now, which we perceive to be so grand because it is our experience, aren't necessarily that different from the same struggles experienced by those 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And in being able to see how those are all the same, we then can perhaps get to a closer solution, because we can then take lessons from those eras, because they are then applicable to life as we know it now. Of course, it's not necessarily going to be one-to-one, but this album is just trying to express that. It's as simple as that. It's not that complicated. And on top of that, I find it artistically rewarding, because the songs inside of this album are some of the tightest to date by the Voidz. I like some of these songs more than I like songs off of Virtue and Tyranny. But of course, it's a vast spectrum, just like all of the sounds of the Voidz and what it is that they're trying to do in the first place. I'm simply dumbfounded why people can be so upset about a record like this, because it's the Voidz doing the thing that they've always done, except they're doing it in a way which then is going to further somewhat deviate from what it is they've done originally, and that's just going to upset people. It's like the most typical type of progression known to man of how people look at artists, of you're not going to give me the same thing anymore, and so I'm going to be upset by it, or I'm going to be upset at how you're not making the moves I want you to make. That's not how art works. But also, that's one of the struggles with the Voidz. From Tyranny to Virtue, and even to this record, they have been in an ongoing battle with the mainstream. They're trying to make songs that are more palatable and digestible, to make their message more effective, and yet people are having issues then when that strategy somewhat starts, I don't even know what, because I can't think of an area on this album where it doesn't work. And on top of that, it's incredibly toxic, especially to artists like the Voidz, who are so eclectic and have such a strong foundation that they can push themselves in these other directions, to then want to try and box them back into the successes of their past. But I think it all comes down to one element that is entirely irrelevant from this record, and even I have somewhat of an issue with. It's that the songs on this album, for the most part, were already out there. This record had 5 singles released ahead of the LP's drop, and it's only 10 songs on the album. Again, the walk-off is just the overture. So it's only like 9 songs on this album. And the overture was released as a single part of the promotion with the album back in July. Prophecy of the Dragon was a single released in 2023 on the tail of their Daft Punk release, Infinity Repeating, the lost track from Random Access Memories. Then there was All the Same, which was released, I think, early 2024, and it's been out for maybe like 6 or so months. At this point, 7 Horses was released the week of Like All Before You's release. It was released on that Monday. And then Flexorcist was released, I think, October of 2023, if I remember right. So I think what the biggest issue that most Voidz fans have is, it's not the autotune. It's not that the album is messy. It's not that it's low effort. I think they're just disappointed that there is no surprise. Because when you listen to Julian Casablancas' work, from like Phrases of the Young and Angles, because you have to think back to this era, Come Down Machine, I think, was out around the time Tyranny came out. And so when getting hit with an album like Tyranny and seeing Julian flexing muscles that he never really was able to flex inside of his other work, that created such a pleasant surprise among so many listeners that it's probably what made them Voidz fans. And then even ahead of Virtue, you know, they had some singles and stuff release. It's what you do as a band to try and build anticipation for the album, but it had more songs to it. I think it's a 12-song LP. And that, on top of having about an hour run length, people still were able to have that surprise. But when you are a band that keeps throwing surprises, at a certain point, that element, it starts to dull, no matter even what more creative of a direction you go in. Because I can tell you as a Voidz listener, Square Wave is a pleasant surprise in certain ways. It's not that much of a deviation from their sound, but it's so much more laid back. It doesn't really rely on using pads for the atmosphere. It does everything so much more quaintly than the noise that they blast on Virtue and Tyranny. I thought it was a great direction that they tried to go inside of that song. Spectral Analysis, I would have never guessed they would have ever written. I would have never told you that the Voidz were going to write an anime ballad, and yet they wrote it on this album. And then they have these other more type of future post-punk techno songs like Perseverance, and even When Will the Bastards End is kind of like that. It's an album that still has all of these surprises, but because it's only about 4 new songs then at that point, that's probably what disappoints the Voidz fans. They're disappointed that they are not experiencing that same level of surprise that Julian and the band have been able to assert with their other releases, and even with some of their singles, including like Alien Crime Lord or the Terrible Records EP that they did with Mac DeMarco. And that's simply a theory, of course. There's going to be holes inside of it, but I feel that if that is the case, if there is an element where there's a lack of surprise and that is being a value judgment on this record, that's just not fair. Because I don't see as an artistic piece how Like All Before You is not a good Voidz record. I even saw some people trying to compare it to First Impressions of Earth inside of the discography of the Strokes. And if you've watched my channel and you've watched my ranking of Strokes albums, then you know how fucking foolish you sound saying that, because First Impressions of Earth is probably their most artistic endeavor in terms of just the emotional rawness and how they're able to channel all of that, especially through the instrumentation. The whole record itself stands so strongly because of everything they had been through prior with Room on Fire and Is This It? And in a lot of ways, Like All Before You somewhat parallels that, because Tyranny and Virtue stand so strongly by themselves that there was a question of how do the Voidz follow up records like this? And it may have been a doom from the start type of element too with Like All Before You. I don't know. But I just wanted to record this emergency video because while I respect people having opinions, even going to just, I don't like this, I do like this, when we start trying to be objective and rationalizing the art and starting to say that this is terrible stuff by the Voidz, that this is weak stuff, then all we're doing is we're diminishing what it is that they're trying to do, and we're not even trying to hear for ourselves what it is they're trying to do. Because instead we're just thinking that if it's not hitting us in the first moment that we're exposed to it, that the artists are failing us. The artists are doing a bad job, when that is not the case. Art is a two-way street. It is trying to meet in the middle between the artist's intention and your experience as the listener and as the viewer. But if you don't give an inch, if you don't give any allowance to the artist having any intention around what it is they're trying to do, and instead wall yourself off by saying, oh, there's too much auto-tune, oh, I don't like the instrumentation, oh, the drum beat sounds lazy and trite, then you're not going to be able to experience what it is the artist was trying to intend. And in a way, you're robbing yourself of that. And it's somewhat unfair to the artist as well. Of course, this is purely in the objective artistry discussion. If you want to just boil it down to as simple as, I don't like it, I do like it, whatever. But if we're starting to have that discussion about how effectively the Voidz are fulfilling their objectives inside of this music, then we can't say, well, the auto-tune stands in the way, when very clearly in every song, Julian's use of it is functional. It's not him trying to just make his voice sound more polished. It's him trying to add layers and filters to his voice to further the sound of the Voidz, to further them into what we think of as music from the future, and trying to push that stuff forward. This is what the Voidz have always been. Nobody should be surprised by this record. I know that if you're watching this video and you are a true Voidz fan, that you probably liked this record because you've heard everything they've done. And so even if you might have not liked a song at first, you went, these are the Voidz. I trust that they are trying to do something. And when you give them that second, that third chance, things start coming together. And like I said, it's not a complex thing. This album, while not trying to be like Tyranny and Virtue in its concept, still comes together under one theme. Like All Before You is a cautionary tale. It is just remembering that we are not that special, to quote Flexorcist, what don't you understand? But also, in knowing we're not that special, being able to look beyond us to the past and see what this journey of humanity has been, and how through all of the toil and tragedy and trauma, and even, the successes and the glory and the advancements, all of that mess, what can we learn from it? And how can we avoid perpetuating the harms and turmoils of our ancestors as we try to move society and civilization closer to that paradise, whatever it is? That's all this album is trying to do. It's not that hard. It's not a hodgepodge. It's, again, it's as much as what Virtue did, of how Wink is one song that's kind of like a tropical bossa nova groove, and then how One of the Ones is more kind of heavy hitting, Black Hole is more kind of Black Flaggy. Like, it's the same principle of just jumping from the genres. But for some reason, people will say, I like how they did it on Virtue. I don't like how they did it on Like All Before You. And again, if it's just a personal thing, that's one thing. But if we start trying to talk about art objectively, it's an entirely different discussion. That's all. It's a good record. It's way better than 2.5 stars. I just wanted to voice all of this because as much as I am a fan of the Voidz and I appreciate their work, I'm not necessarily just trying to fanboy for them. I am a person who listens to this stuff because it has certain impacts on me. It gets my brain thinking in ways I might not have been able to, and I've always known that they can do that. And so even me, on my first listen, I trusted that I probably needed to listen to it a second time to actually understand what was going on. And so when I see other people robbing themselves of that and just trying to assign it as a terrible album, I feel disheartened, because there's so many wonderful things that are happening on this record that are then just thrown out because I guess they aren't polished enough. They aren't tuned. There's too much autotune. I don't fucking know. Yeah, that's it. Enjoy the record. Give it a second listen if you didn't like it at first. And try not to be so harsh about the art you like. Be critical, but don't be harsh. Especially when that art you know is trying to push you in ways you might not even know. Because if you were a Voidz fan at first from Tyranny, you should know that. And so Like All Before You should not be any surprise. That's it. I'm going home and I'm going to listen to more songs off this record.